Hey friends, thanks so much for coming and listening to your lesson this week, and we are just going to have a lot of fun. I can't wait to see what happens with David. Gotta tell you, I've had a little sneak peek and it's really, really cool. So last week we saw where Abigail saved the day. She saved David from doing something that he would have regretted for the rest of his life, and she was so brave standing up to him and his army like that. So, and he had in return promised her that he would always take care of her after her husband Nabal died. So David could have taken Nabal's house and his land, but he didn't because he had to keep being on the move. He couldn't stay in one place because he knew that Saul would eventually come after him again. So he needed to make sure that he kept everybody safe. So he had to be smart and he had to be careful. So he took Abigail, his men, and their families, and he took them to a place called Ziph. And he took them there to try to keep them safe. But of course, Saul found out where David was, and despite his promise to leave David alone, he took his army of 3,000 and went to find David. David and his men went back to the wilderness until David's spies told him that Saul had indeed arrived. David and one of his men waited until nightfall to go kind of check things out where Saul was. So when they walked down to Saul's camp, there they found Saul sound asleep at their camp. But not only Saul, he was surrounded by his army as if they were going to protect him somehow. And literally right there next to Saul, sound asleep, was his captain, the head of his army. Even the head of the army was asleep. They were all asleep. David and the man that was with him actually started arguing about what they were going to do. See, the man with David wanted David to finally destroy Saul and just be done with it. And David was arguing back saying, no, I can't do that. God doesn't want me to do that. And so they were kind of arguing back and forth. So finally what they did is they walked up to Saul very quietly and they took his jug of water and his spear that was right there by his head, and they backed away at a safe distance. When they were far enough away, David started yelling at the captain, at Saul's captain that was sitting right there next to him, started yelling at him, and the captain woke up with a start. What's going on? And David started yelling at him, and he said, are you the one that's supposed to be protecting your king? You did a terrible job. There's no way that you can protect him while you're asleep. I can't believe you did that. Because of you and the terrible job that you did, look at what I have. And he held up the jar of water and the spear that was right next to Saul's head and said, look, this is what I have. I got this close to him. And Saul woke up and hearing the commotion, and he recognized David's voice. And he called out to David, David, is that you? Is that you? And David called back to him and said, yes, it is me. Saul realized that David could have hurt him again, but he didn't. And he immediately started telling David that he understood that he was wrong in what he did, and he promised to never go after him again. Well, David had heard that before a couple of times, so he didn't really believe Saul this time. And so he just simply gave Saul back his spear and his jug of water, and he said, because I obeyed God today, he will take all of my troubles away. And Saul was just a little shocked, and he looked at David and he told David, you're gonna do great things. David knew that as long as Saul was alive, he would never be safe. So he went to a city called Gath and wanted to talk to their king about staying there. Now, this wasn't just any king. This was a Philistine king. Remember the Philistines? They're kind of the ones that David has been fighting for all of these years. They're his enemy. But he went to their king anyway, looking to see if he could stay there, he and his men, because he had an idea. See, the Philistines weren't just enemies with David. Their main number one enemy was King Saul and his men. And David knew that King Saul was afraid of the Philistines. So he knew that if he could somehow join forces with the Philistines for just a little while, that he would be safe from King Saul, because there was no way that King Saul would go after him if he was in the Philistine camp. So the Philistine king kind of looked at David and his 600 men army, and he decided, since now David is enemies with King Saul, this could be a good thing. And he decided to join forces with David and allow him to stay as long as they both fought on the same side. So David and his men went and they fought all of these battles of enemies of the Israelites. And the Israelites are David's people, right? So they go and they fight all these enemies of the Israelites, and they fight all these battles and they win, and David starts bringing back with him all of his winnings, like all of their stuff, the clothes that were left behind and the animals and all kinds of stuff, and he brings it back. Well, the Philistine king sees this and he's like, whoa, David, what have you been doing? Who have you been fighting? Like, what's going on? So David didn't really want the Philistine king to know that he was fighting enemies of the Israelites, because the Philistine king, again, is enemies with the Israelites, right? So David just kind of pointed him in a direction, and he said, oh, in that area down there. And that just so happened to be around the area that the Israelites were. So the Philistine king thought that David had been fighting the Israelites. That was pretty smart, because that just made the Philistine king think that David was really, truly on his side. So that was pretty smart of David, except now all the Philistines are joining their armies, and they're about to go after King Saul and his people. And they're expecting David to come with them and fight with them. Uh-oh. But then the princes of the Philistines saw that David was with them, and they got really worried, because, David's been their enemy for a while. They know who he is. So they got really worried, and they told the king that David needed to go, because he could easily, in the middle of the battle, decide to switch sides and start fighting with King Saul instead and help defeat them. And it would be really easy for David to beat the Philistines if he's in the middle of them with his army. So they told him, you got to tell David he's got to go. We don't trust him. The king tried to explain and tried to tell them that no, David wouldn't do that. He's been fighting the Israelites this whole time, and he won't do that. He'll fight with us the whole time. But the princes didn't think so. So they told the king, nope, you gotta get rid of him. That was a pretty smart choice, if you ask me. So the king told David that he needed to leave. So the next morning, David and his men gathered their things and they started the journey home. What's awesome and wonderful is that this is the battle that King Saul finally loses. The Philistines ended up defeating King Saul and his army, and King Saul fell on his sword and he died. So David doesn't know that yet. But remember, David never wanted to fight King Saul. He knew that he couldn't do that because that's something that God would never want him to do. He could have hurt him so many times, but he refused because he was going to obey God and what God wanted him to do. So this whole time, David has just been putting complete faith in God that he will direct his situation, because can you imagine trying to be in the middle of these Philistines, and then all of a sudden they're going after the same guy that you don't want to hurt because you're trying to obey God? I wonder if he got a little nervous. but he doesn't really appear to be that way in the Bible. He just knew that God would take care of it, and he would just continue to be faithful, and God took care of it. He had the princes get worried about him and had David sent away so that he wouldn't have to fight King Saul. So that is crazy. I wonder if when David finally gets home, if he can finally have some peace and kind of relax a little bit. But I don't know. We'll have to see. His life has been pretty crazy here recently. So we will see what happens with him next week when he gets home. And we will see you guys then. Bye.